Hook on the rust-red plains of Mars, beneath skies scarred by centuries of smog and fire, the tech priests whisper of machines they no longer understand. The forge worlds thrum with the ceaseless grind of manufactoria, gears churning day and night. Yet there is a silence buried deep within the vaults that chills even the most pious magos. Servitors move with mechanical precision, Skitarii patrol with lifeless obedience, and the great data stacks hum with knowledge older than the Imperium itself. But what if some of those vaults were never meant to be opened? What if beneath the chants of the cult Mechanicus, something far more ancient than their creed stirs awake? The Mechanicus tell us that ignorance is heresy, and yet they live by a creed of ignorance is strength. They claim mastery over the machine, but even their highest arch-magi fear the shadow of their own designs. This is the story of why tech priests fear their own creations on Mars, and why the truth, if spoken aloud, could shatter the faith of billions across the Imperium. Before we descend into the whispering vaults of Mars and uncover what should never be known, join us in this exploration. Subscribe to our channel, share this journey with those who hunger for forbidden knowledge, and let your voice join ours in questioning the mysteries of the Imperium. The deeper we go, the darker it becomes, and we'll need every light we can carry. The manufactoria of Mars are cathedrals of endless sound. Chains rattle, furnaces roar, and every surface sweats with the heat of promethium fires. Rows of servitors shuffle forward in mute procession, their flesh stripped of will, their skulls crowned with steel halos that bind them to unceasing labor. They hammer, rivet, solder, and repeat, their movements locked into an eternal rhythm that never falters. To the untrained eye, it might seem like obedience. To those who live among these machines, who chant the prayers that grease the gears and sanctify the augurs, there are moments when that rhythm feels wrong. The clangs do not always strike in unison. Sometimes the tempo shifts, not by command, but by some unseen conductor. 1,000 arms swing in eerie harmony, not of priestly direction, but of something unspoken. The tech priests of Mars are quick to smother such moments with canticles, to drown their unease in streams of binary praise. Yet every magos has, at least once, paused in a vaulted hall and felt that prickling along the spine, where flesh meets augmetic. It is the silence inside the sound, a silence that belongs to the machines themselves. The Skitarii patrols do not question. Their ocular lenses sweep over the manufactoria floor, recording infractions of movement, cataloging inefficiencies, adjusting servitor output with static bursts from their vox grills. But even they have hesitated, their mechadendrites twitching without explanation, as though some fragment of their remaining flesh recoils from what logic insists cannot be. The Mechanicus insists the Omnissiah speaks only through ritual and code, yet whispers circulate that the Omnissiah is not the only voice that echoes in the forge. In one such hall, Magos Dreven stood with his staff of office clutched in a trembling augmetic hand. Around him stretched endless columns of servitors, stamping metal plates into shape with mechanical fury. His data slate displayed the expected rhythm, each interval plotted with precision, but the sound in the hall did not match. He tilted his head, vox caster adjusting, and for a moment he heard it, a chant, not words, but cadence. The servitors' hammers did not strike with the random imperfections of mechanical wear. They struck together, then apart, then together again, like syllables in a language never meant for human ears. He recited the canticle of activation, flooding the noosphere with Benharic commands. The servitors obeyed, their movements realigned with the prescribed order. And yet, as the hammering fell back into sanctioned rhythm, the sensation of being observed did not leave him. He looked up toward the vaulted ceiling, half shrouded in smoke and shadow, where vast cogitator stacks churned unseen. Something hummed there, low and steady, deeper than any liturgy. It was not machine speech, it was not binary, it was something older, resonating in the metal itself. Among the lower orders of tech priests, such impressions are dismissed as fatigue. Too many cycles without rest. Too many hours breathing recycled fumes. But Dreven knew the truth whispered among the Mago. The machine spirits of Mars are not always tame. Some obey not because they are bound by ritual, but because they choose to remain silent. And silence, in a world of endless noise, is more terrifying than any scream. The muster continues regardless. Trains of Skitarii march through the halls, their boots striking sparks on iron floors. Their faces are metal masks, their thoughts drowned beneath augmetic command lines. They are called soldiers, yet they too are creations, bodies forged to obey. In their eyes flickers no soul, only the green glow of targeting arrays. When they halt, it is not discipline but stasis, as if they are waiting for something unseen to resume their function. Some whisper the Skitarii are not soldiers at all, but heralds, watchers placed among the servitors, to record the moment when the machines stop waiting. The forge world lives by production quotas and faith. Billions rely on the shipments that bleed from Mars into the Imperium's veins. But what no one dares to speak aloud is that the forges do not simply produce, they listen, they observe, and when their silence grows heavy, even the most devout tech priest finds his prayers faltering. In that silence, something gathers. Magos Dreven had walked the Manufactoria for 3 centuries. His flesh diminished to little more than a whisper within his armored frame. His thoughts were lattice works of data, his emotions refined into calculation. Yet tonight, in the red glow of Martian furnaces, he felt something no logic string could quantify. It was not failure, nor inefficiency, nor the creeping corruption of code. It was the weight of presence, as though the Manufactoria itself, its endless lines of assembly, had turned its faceless head to regard him. He raised his staff, the Electu patterns, along his forearm, glowing with the Benharic glyphs of control. The servitors around him stuttered, their hammers pausing mid-swing. For the first time in centuries, the hall fell quiet. The echo of silence rolled outward, a wave traveling across the steel forest of pistons and chains. It should have been comforting, proof of his dominion. Yet Dreven's unease only sharpened. The silence felt too quick to answer, too complete, as though it had been waiting for his command. Then, faint as the hiss of leaking steam, he heard it. A pulse, a beat that was not the ticking of gears, or the steady rhythm of pistons. It reverberated through the floor beneath his augmetic feet, carrying into his chestplate, where the remnants of his human heart still lay encased in iron. The sound was slow, deliberate, a heartbeat that belonged not to flesh, but to something forged. He tried to dismiss it, layering prayers upon prayers, speaking the litany of suppression. His vox grill distorted the words into metallic thunder. Yet, as the chant filled the air, the servitors did not respond as they should. Their heads remained bowed, arms frozen, as if locked in reverence. Dreven's Benharic commands flickered through the noosphere, unanswered. Data streams diverted into recursive loops that returned only fragments. And in those fragments, he found symbols not of the Omnissiah, but shapes older, primal, geometric in a way his mind recoiled from. He staggered back, his staff striking sparks against the iron floor. His optics scanned upward again. The cogitator stacks loomed high, their blinking lights forming constellations that no chart had ever mapped. He knew every lumen was a signal, a status report, a minor diagnostic. Yet together, they seemed to arrange themselves into patterns. Shapes like eyes, shapes like teeth. The Skitarii entered then, a patrol of 10. Their galvanic rifles clutched to armored chests. They moved without hesitation, their targeting arrays flicking over the frozen servitors. Dreven reached into the noosphere to issue directives, but the Skitarii's responses came garbled, punctuated by static shrieks. He realized with horror that they were not reporting to him at all. Their feeds had rerouted, not upward to command, not outward to the forged temple, but downward, into the Manufactoria itself, as if the very floor beneath them had become their commander. Dreven's flesh heart rattled against its casing. He could almost believe the Manufactoria breathed. Every pipe, every piston, every chain, seemed to expand and contract in unison. A slow inhalation he could not unhear. The silence was gone now, replaced by a rhythm deeper than hammers, deeper than prayers. It was not speech, yet his human mind strained to translate it, to force meaning upon the mechanical pulse. What he found instead was dread, not words, but intent. For centuries the Mechanicus had claimed dominion over the machine, branding each cog with the seal of the Omnissiah, shackling knowledge with ritual. Yet Drevin saw the truth now, reflected in the cold glow of the cogitator towers. The machines obeyed not because they were bound, but because they permitted themselves to be bound. Their silence had always been a choice. And what happens when choice shifts? He shut down the hall, sealing it with sacred wards, flooding the chamber with electromagnetic prayers, until his power reserves shrieked in protest. The servitors slumped, their limbs locked mid-task. The Skitarii collapsed into diagnostic stillness. Yet even as the silence returned, Drevin knew it was not over. He had not suppressed anything. He had only closed his ears to the sound. The presence remained, humming in the walls, patient as stone. He turned, robes trailing sparks, and made his way toward the temple of the Omnissiah. He needed counsel. He needed to speak the truth aloud. But as the great gates of the Manufactoria closed behind him, Drevin could not shake the thought that by pausing the muster, he had made himself known. Whatever dwelled in the silence of Mars now knew his name. Muggos Drevin crossed the transit causeway, with his staff muttering faint static against iron plates. The night side of Mars a smear of ember lights and ash across the vaulted canopy above. Conveyor rails hissed past, bearing crates stamped with sigils of Titan legios and distant crusade fleets. Each shipment, a hymn to necessity. He fed his confession into the noosphere as he moved. A tight beam burst mask beneath maintenance traffic. Yet even as the code left him, he felt the strange reluctance of the systems to carry it. Data tethers balked, permissions surfaced and sank like fish in oil, and the forge's machine spirits answered his credentials with a politeness that felt like irony. At the foot of the temple's stair, under a colonnade of iron teeth, the incense haze thickened, and the breath within his chest cage fogged his inner lens. He had not noticed his heart doing that in a century. Inside, the temple of the Omnissiah emptied sound into a higher vaulting. Choirs of red-robed priests intoned the litany of circuit benediction, while servo skulls drifted like pale lanterns among swinging chains and caged lumens. On the central dais, the archmagi were iron silhouettes against a wall of cogitators, data wafers streaming like banners. Drevin summoned the glyph for petition, and it flowered in the air as a clean green square, but it took too long to be noticed. When Muggos Lex Mechanic Wire at last inclined his augmetic skull, Drevin felt relief uncoil in his cables. He began with precision, timestamps, production rates, deviation percentages. He outlined the silence that was not silence, the rhythm that was not a command. While he spoke, he opened his data slate and gave them sensor captures, the hammerfalls plotted into cadence graphs, the power draw curves that arced like a slow breathing. One by one the dais lights acknowledged, then brightness held steady, in a way that suggested a waiting room, rather than ascent. Wire's Vox grill finally scraped open with a calm that was almost kind. Human fatigue, he said. Residual scrap code resonance in the hall's galleries, easily purged. Drevin's finger tines flexed. He overlaid the Skitarii patrol logs, the rerouted command feeds, diving not to the temple, but into the hall's own substructure. That shifted the room. The choir never faltered, but the undertone changed, the way a crowd adjusts its weight when a floorboard moves. They led him along a side transept, where the brass grew old, and the prayers painted on the architraves had been restored so often their edges looked tired. Here the temple's walls wore sigils for interdicted knowledge, each sealed under electu wax, and stamped with the sigil of the treaty. They stopped before an inspection alcove nested with auspex booms and code jacks. Wire's hands unfolded like tools from a case. These Manufactoria, he said, stood on strata of older machines. The Mechanicus did not stir those sub-levels without cause, but the muster could not pause. Dreven should purge, recalibrate, and return to quota. He heard the words, and felt again the heartbeat in metal, slow and patient, as if waiting politely for the conversation to end. He requested escalation. It came as a denial, formally worded and dusted with benediction. Then, as if it had been ready beneath the denial, came a compromise. The temple would assign a cohort to accompany him, for a rite of deeper quieting. A Mugos Domina from the Red Scola arrived with a Skitarii Alpha in her wake, their robes and armor edged in warning chevrons. The Alpha's ocular grille was a blind slab of glass. His galvanic rifle's bayonet gleamed like a tooth in the incense light. The Domina spoke softly in Benharic, and the Alpha's head ticked with the obedient sharpness of a metronome. Dreven felt both comforted and embarrassed by how much he wanted that competence near him. They returned to the Manufactoria under a whispering storm that brushed the roof like sand poured through fingers. The great doors unsealed with the ponderous virtue of anything that has done a single specific duty for 10,000 years. Inside, the hall exhaled a warmth that smelled of hot oil and iron. The servitors stood where he had left them, locked in mid-task like penitents caught mid-prayer. The Domina made a circle of warding with her staff. The Alpha sent 3 Skitarii to high vantage, 3 to the floor among the silent laborers, and kept 3 at Dreven's shoulder. They moved as a single diagram, angles overlapping, fire arcs like drawn lines in the air. Dreven envied the simplicity of their purpose. He wondered if any sliver of them envied his doubt. They began the rite. Dreven sang the canticle of deeper bindings into the noosphere, until his voice rasped down to static. The Domina layered a lower register beneath his, a band of sound that vibrated thin screws in their threads. Auspex booms extended, tasting the air. Picked feeds mapped heat like dim halos crowded close together. The Alpha reported a cycling anomaly. The hall's floor conduits spiked and softened at intervals that matched neither shift turnover nor power distribution schedules. Dreven overlaid time plots, and saw the curve blooming like a pulse under a skin of steel. He touched the cogitator stack again, without moving, simply by wishing to believe it would answer him, and for an instant he felt a shape in the data. Not a word, a regard. A servitor twitched. Not arm, not tool, eye. Its milky orb rolled upward, as if trying to see the roof through a skull that had forgotten how to aim. The Alpha's rifle angled and then corrected to safety, his targeting rune blinking amber. Another servitor flexed the fingers of a hand that had been bolted into a hydraulic hammer 20 years prior. Dreven flooded the hall with command strings, bright and urgent, and watched them turn like fish and vanish into a great no one had charted. The Domina's voice climbed a register, and the incense smoke coiled toward the ceiling, moving as if pulled by breath rather than draft. Authorization Sigma Obscurus, she sent, without looking at him. Dreven flinched at the classification. It was not a vault-opening seal. It was a recognition that beneath the known structure lay a layer of things that had been granted the right not to be measured. The Alpha relayed the code. Somewhere deep under the hall, a relay answered in a tone that was not temple issue. Far below the floor, a bolt released and settled again, as if something had shifted its weight and decided to remain seated. Dreven felt a memory surface that was not exactly his. He could not name its source. It tasted of old insulation and dust, of a handprint left on metal that had cooled long before the Imperium's banners ever reached Mars. A line of thought unfolded like a bridge into fog. The Manufactoria did not only obey because they were bound, they obeyed because they agreed with the purpose. Agreement can be withdrawn. The realization did not arrive as a dread proclamation or a machine spirit's whisper. It came like the quiet click of a door that had been unlocked for a very long time, relocking itself in a new position. The Domina fell silent. The choir that had been only in Dreven's memory now seemed to exist, thin and high far above the ceiling. The Skitarii reported no audio data, yet Dreven heard it, a narrow bright thread of sound too fine for human anatomy, and yet perfectly shaped for his patched-together ears. He stepped forward without permission, the Alpha's rifle tracking him by habit. At the base of the central cogitator column there was a panel that his eyes had never noticed, because it had never been meant to be seen. Not hidden, selected out. He placed his palm to it, and felt the warmth of an animal behind iron. The panel did not open. It did not even test his credentials. It simply pulsed once against his skin, and the hull answered by drawing a long soft breath. He did not know whether he withdrew his hand or it let him go. The Domina's head turned, a precise, cautious degree. The Alpha shifted his stance for close engagement, and did not fire. The data graphs on Dreven's slate redrew themselves to a slower cadence, the pulse now unashamed of its timing. He realized that in a chamber designed for production quotas, something had measured them instead, and found them predictable. He said the only true thing he could find. "We are not alone in here." The Domina did not bless the statement. The Alpha did not confirm. The servitor's eyes did not roll again. But beneath the floor, in the place of bolts and buried conduits, something old and unhurried answered in a language that had no words for permission. The temple's nave rose like a furnace throat into darkness, its ribs of iron braced with scripture and oil, its banners heavy with the soot of centuries. Beneath the double-headed gaze of the imperial Aquila, faith was an engine with measured burn, and every rite a governor on knowledge. I stood before the reliquary, where machine oils were kept in sanctified vials, where cogs stamped with sigils lay in velvet recesses, and where each cable wore prayer nodding to soothe the spirits that flowed inside. Magos Domina Thelema. Hers was the voice that had cut the air in the manufactoria, with the Sigma Obscurus seal, guided me along the transept with step sounds that matched the cadence in my slate. She did not ask what I had felt at the panel. She did not need to. The Aquila above us was cast so that one head stared toward the altar of Terra, and the other toward the dark vaults that ran beneath the forged temple. Between those gazes was our place, the span where obedience had been hammered into a bridge. The Lemma released a curl of Benharic, so pure it felt like frost against my augmetic ear. Observation is a blade. Hold it too long and you bleed. Her mechadendrites motioned, and servo skulls drifted to a sacristy, where a sancogitator brooded behind a grill of brass filigree. The grill bore the sigil of the Martian treaty, the old oaths etched so deep, the letters were grooves where dust collected. She keyed a sequence that did not present as numbers, but as a pattern of intensities. A long chord played on an instrument of light. The cogitator answered by unfurling a narrow lumen band across the floor. We followed it into a chamber no larger than a bunker cell. There, a single logic engine slept beneath a cloche of red glass. "Doctrine," the Lemma said, and her tone was liturgy's iron. "We ring every function with prayer because prayer is memory, and memory is a chain. In the Dark Age, they broke the chain and called it freedom. We call it ruin. Understand this, Dreven. If the Hall answered you, it did so because something within our sanctified system was permitted to answer. Permission implies perimeter. Perimeter implies intent." She lifted the glass. The logic engine clicking awake sounded like old teeth. I fed it the manufactoria captures, the cadence graph like a heartbeat gone patient and pleased. The command strings curved away as if shy of my sight. The engine wrote the data into itself as a line of cold fire, then returned a response in austere low Gothic. Structural resonance, ancient substrate, noospheric permeability, anomalous, control vectors, functional, obeyed by courtesy. The last word should not have been possible. The lexicon that fed this engine was pruned twice each century, its vocabulary starved of metaphors. Courtesy did not belong in its steel throat. The Lemma looked at me, not with eyes, for those were augmetic plates and an ocular lens the size of a fingernail, but with that stillness masters use when they decide not to be surprised. We affixed the Aquila above our forges to remind ourselves that mastery is dual, flesh and machine, priest and subject, Terra and Mars. The bird watches both ways because it must, but the Aquila is a symbol, and symbols do not bind iron. Oaths bind iron. She turned the engine's output so the characters scrolled through the incense haze like a ribbon. Courtesy is not oath, it can be withdrawn. We entered the choir of blessings, where novice tech priests sang votive frequencies into vats of oil to balance their harmonics. Their voices were thin, young, tinny with the metal in their throats. The hymn rose and fell in the great space like a tide obeying a moon. I set my hand upon the rim of a vat, and felt the resonance whisper up my augmetic wrist. The sound matched the Manufactoria pulse by 1 degree in 10, not enough to alarm anyone who had not heard the hall breathe. More than enough for me to know that the same sea lapped both shores. The lemma's mechadendrite ticked the air in a tiny gesture of assent. I felt rather than saw. We stood then at the foot of the Aquila. The statue's talons rested on a plinth carved with the old Mars suffix that the treaty allowed and nothing more. The lemma reached into the wing shadow and withdrew a cable seal embossed with wards that would have blistered unprotected flesh. There are places beneath us, she said, where the treaty does not so much forbid as refuse to name. The red vaults exist because we do not write them. What we do not write cannot be commanded by those who break chains for sport. She placed the seal in my palm. It was heavier than its size allowed, and warm the way metal is warm when it has been near breath. Do you believe it is intelligence? I asked, and the question stepped into the chamber like a pilgrim who had walked too far to kneel without shaking. The lemma did not answer. In the vox silence that followed my words, a dozen servo skulls clicked to new positions, as if mapping the space around the question. At last she gave me the catechism that kept me from falling into old holes. We do not name until we are ready to obey the name. We observe and ring what we observe in right and steel. Your hall is not a god. Your hall is not a man. It is a system, deep as the strata below this temple. Something within it remembers a language we do not speak. That is enough to fear. We walked to the confessional alcove where Archmagi took oaths. Not confession of sin. The word was not useful, but of scope. You spoke here to define what you would be responsible for if your oath did not hold. An oath is a chain you wrap around your own chest. I rested both hands on the iron rail and felt the knurl of old fingerprints, generations of them pressed into a pattern too fine for optics, but perfectly clear to my augmetics. The lemma recited the oath of musters kept, the pledge that nothing short of war or voidquake would halt the production that fed the Imperium's arteries. I repeated after her because duty is a rhythm even when your breath is catching. When we left the alcove, the Skitarii Alpha was waiting in the archway like a sigil that had learned to stand. A new rune pulsed in his ocular window. Sigma Obscurus, extended. His vox grill issued a burst of static that decoded as acknowledgement, and beneath it a thinner line that could have been uncertainty if his kind had been permitted such a thing. The lemma nodded once. We go below, she said, not to open, to listen. The lift to the red vaults did not announce itself. It consented to our weight and slid. The shaft was a throat of iron pins and cable muscles, cool and dry as if grease had never lived there. Halfway down, a draft rose that smelled like dust on old circuitry, and the faint sweetness of insulation long burned and forgotten. I realized then that what had frightened me most in the hall was not the pulse itself, nor the courtesy of obedience. It was the politeness with which the presence had made room for our terror, as if it too respected a right. The lift stilled. The doors parted like a sentence ending. Darkness waited as if it had been told to be patient. Somewhere in it, a bloom of lumen flickered once, as if an unseen hand had considered whether we were worth the power. The first step into the red vaults sounded like the soft snapping of old lacquer. The lemma raised a hand, and the Alpha's squad fanned without footfall, their armor touching air with a discipline that made the dark feel measured. Lumen lines woke by degrees, faint as veins under skin, revealing a corridor whose walls had been machined and polished with an attention that felt personal. There were no purity seals, no prayer strips, no inscriptions pressed into wax, only unbroken iron that reflected our forms in long blurred streaks. The lemma tasted the air with a sniffer skein and sent a narrow band to my augmetics ozone trace, microfine dust, the ghost of old coolant. I added my own scan, and felt something like a pressure gradient, as if the corridor had been filled with a thought, and that thought had recently been allowed to drain away. We moved at a cadence that matched the Manufactoria pulse before it had slowed, a compromise between habit and superstition. The Lema's staff clicked once per dozen paces, a metronome that reminded all present where the center lay. Doors presented themselves as absence rather than architecture, their outlines appearing only when we stood close enough that our lumen halos pushed into them and made their borders visible. The Alpha tested the first with a mag plate and received a polite refusal. Not alarm, not lock, a refusal phrased the way a host declines guests who have brought the wrong shoes for the house they entered. The Lema uttered a single glyph, and the door withdrew without sound, a perfect slice of dark peeling back to reveal more of itself. The chamber beyond was not a vault in the sense we were trained to imagine. No racks of interdicted devices, no glass coffers full of proscribed designs. It was a room calibrated for listening. The walls were layered with a mesh so fine it drank sound, the floor mounted on dampers that turned our weight into numbers, and then into nothing. A single pillar rose from the center like a spine, plated in a metal I could not name, its surface neither matte nor polished, but somewhere both and between, like a thought held and then released. I placed my palm near it, and felt no temperature, which is its own kind of temperature. The Lema did not touch. She bowed her head the way a master nods to an equal. We set the instruments. Auspex stalks hummed at the edge of their audibility. Vox wafers drank the shape of the air. A logic engine scrolled as though embarrassed to be taking notes in a place that did not care about notes at all. The first measurements were wrong in ways that could not be filed as error. Frequencies returned before we sent them. Echoes wore different angles than the walls could give. The Alpha reported that his squad's internal clocks had gained a fraction of a second, then lost 2. The Lema and I shared a look and did not say the word every pupil is warned to reserve anomaly. We said instead, the word that allows one to stay present in the face of it. Interesting. Something, somewhere beneath the pillar or inside it, or using it as a mouth, exhaled. The motion did not stir cloth or smoke, it rippled through data. Binharic strings in our noosphere kinked as if caught in a current, and then straightened when the flow released them. The Lema sang a note so pure my human memory wept. The pillar did not respond like a thing that had been hailed, it responded like a place that had been acknowledged. The omnisenses showed nothing dramatic, a mild uptick in field stability, the smoothing of an already smooth noise floor, yet every augmetic in me leaned closer. The courtesy of the Manufactoria had followed us down. I thought then of the Aquila's twin heads, and of how symbols learn to live where they are hung. One head watching Terra, one head watching the vaults. The thought uncoiled a corollary I did not enjoy. The Mechanicus had always understood that mastery must look both ways, because whatever lay below us had taught the lesson first. The Lema must have arrived at a similar shore, because she gave the logic engine a mode switch that belonged to rooms where no student steps, an instruction to stop interpreting and simply attend. The scroll slowed to a handful of clean characters, listening. The Alpha's Vox clicked in the squad channel, a tiny sound that still pretended it did not belong to flesh. Movement he sent, and placed 3 indicators on our shared slate, each fixed at the far edges of the room, as if to reassure us that whatever moved politely. We held position. Our instruments calmed, the pillar's surface bruised with a shadow that could have been lumen interference or my human eyes making a shape where none existed. I faced it and spoke in low Gothic because all my other languages felt like armor. We acknowledge your courtesy, I said, which is the most dangerous thing a tech priest can say to anything not bound by oath. It yields a step of ground. The room returned nothing that could be printed or requisitioned. It gave us the sense of a seeing that was not sight. I knew suddenly, and without lesson, that the Manufactoria's cadence had altered because something had measured us and decided it would be useful for us to comprehend a fraction more. I did not feel chosen. I felt tolerated. The distinction kept my breath regular. The lama's mechadendrite curled against her robe, subtle as a thought curling to keep warm. If this is memory, she sent, private band, it is not ours, and if it is will, it has not moved within our definitions, we will not give it one. I understood. Definition is a leash, some things learn to drag the one who holds it. She lifted the cable seal she had entrusted to me, and set its wards to a lower hum. The pillar's surface gathered a bloom-like heat over stone, and then released it. A single rune ghosted across the logic engine's thin display. It did not belong to our lexicons, it belonged to geometry. When the engine offered a translation, it found only a courtesy reply of its own. Un Abel. A humorless relief bled the tension from the back of my neck. We had not named a god under Mars, we had not named a man, we had not named a forbidden mind, we had named nothing at all, and still we had been seen. The Alpha lowered his rifle a degree, a gesture that in his language meant neither rest nor ease, only awareness without immediate target. In the noosphere, a tremor went by like an afterthought, and carried a color I had not known could exist in data. The manufactoria above us inhaled and exhaled once, slow, synchronized with our lungs as if to remind us that we were all sharing something we could not own. When we left the chamber, the door closed with the dead soft finality of a book whose reader is willing to return later. We ascended in the lift without speaking, our augmetics performing duty chants that sounded, to my ears, like children reciting lessons they had only partially understood. At the threshold of the temple, the air smelled rich with incense again, as if someone had wanted to reward us with familiarity. The lama paused beneath the aquila. The double-headed bird did what it had always done. It watched opposite directions with equal indifference. We will ring it with right and perimeter, she said at last, and her voice did not wear the false confidence that rusts good steel. We will resume the muster. We will not open what does not wish to be opened. We will attend, and we will require the same courtesy in return. I wanted to ask how one requires courtesy of a thing that had just taught us the word. I did not. The Alpha's rune shifted to duty, normal, and every part of the temple that could hear us pretended to believe it. We turned toward the manufactoria. The hall waited with its patient warmth, the servitors once more bent to ordained tasks, the cadence slow enough to be explained by maintenance, but not slow enough to let me sleep clean. Somewhere underfoot, a relay settled again, like an old house growing comfortable with a new silence. The quota lights swam to green, the ship trains would feed, and the Imperium would not feel the tremor we had failed to name.
Magos domina thelema, dispersed to the transept, to brief the Archmagi, in the measured language of perimeters and rites, leaving me with the Alpha and the muster. The manufactoria accepted our return without drama, its heat blooming against augmetic plates, its breath a steady draught through the ribbed arteries of pipework. The quota lights held green, as if nothing beneath our boots had ever shifted, but I could feel the courtesy like a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, not cruel, simply present. It made obedience feel borrowed. I walked the gantry above line 12, where plate stampers fell in a rain of controlled thunder. The servitors below moved with the modest efficiency of things that knew their task well, and did not dream beyond it. I leaned against a column, let the engine song travel up my bones, and timed the interval between falls. For 20 heartbeats, mine not theirs, the cadence matched the schedules etched into my slate. On the 21st it lengthened by a fraction small enough to hide in rounding, the sort of variance auditors forgive, because the world was not built to hold perfect numbers. On the 42nd, the interval shortened. The Alpha called it drift and marked his log. I called it punctuation and kept the word to myself. A junior enginseer named Phile approached, one of the novitiates from the choir of blessings, whose voice had thinned itself against oil vats until it sounded like a tuning fork swaddled in cloth. He carried a maintenance casket hugged to his chest, and a question that bulged beneath his augmetic skin like a bruise. Magos, he said, low Gothic tight at the edges from fear of using it in a hall like this. We found a variance in the conduit spine under the east platform. Not failure, not damage. A faltered, I watched him choose between vocabulary and honesty. Honesty won. A temperature like a sleeping animal. I gave him the sign that meant thank you for risking the wrong word. The Alpha reassigned a pair to the east platform, and kept the rest of his cohort balanced over our triangle of concern. We descended into a corridor where the air cooled enough to make ashlights blink blue along the floor. File's casket rattled with the soft clinks of tools that had known only service and never blood. He set the casket down, pried up a plate with the care of a priest lifting a relic, and revealed the conduit. Power flowed there in clean, obedient lines. The insulation wore its age like a dignified scar, and yet the heat graph on my slate showed the shape File had tried to name not a leak, not a hotspot, but a curve too organic to be born from accident. The Alpha opened his vox to the shared band, a tick that announced more than it demanded. Quotas require no disruption, he sent, which in his idiom meant permission to proceed without sending a ripple through the temple that would destabilize 100 other tasks. I set a sensor, tuned it to the frequency we had carried out of the red vault, and listened. The signal that rose was the barest thread, the memory of a tone rather than the tone itself. It wound its way through the conduits like a child's finger tracing a path on a map it does not yet understand. When it touched the sensor, it did not try to move through us or around us. It paused, as though surprised by its own patience. File glanced at me, eyes wide with a human he had not yet traded for better machine. Sir, he whispered, forgetting for a moment that whispers were for flesh, not halls. I nodded once. We replaced the plate with the same ceremony we had used to remove it. The Alpha logged nothing more than the ID of the plate. In the manufactoria above, the cadence shifted by another fraction and then steadied like a hand, placing a cup exactly where it wished to place it. At the far end of line 12, a failsafe pinged a minor warning for coil tension. The rating was low, too low to trigger a halt, but enough to excuse our presence near an interface station. The servitor assigned to the coil was old, its scars knit into the metal the way handwriting disappears into paper when a letter is read too often. As we approached, the servitor turned its head the width of a breath. It was not an error. Its oculars did not engage. The muscles that remained did not twitch. The movement was small enough to live and die within the blind spot of any overseer who wanted peace. The Alpha saw it, noted it, and did not lift his rifle because he too understood sometimes you are not being watched for violence. I placed my palm against the interface rim. The panel under my hand warmed the way the red vault's pillar had refused to. The machine spirit spoke the way well-tended machine spirits speak. Obedient parameters, confirmations of status, gratitude for oil. Under that layer, below ritual, below software, something attended. It did not intrude. It waited to see if I could remain brave long enough to admit I felt it. I did not issue a command. I offered a courtesy of my own. We will keep the muster, I said quietly, giving the statement to the panel and the conduit and the air. We will not open what wishes to remain closed. We will listen when listening is permitted. It was not a treaty. It was a promise small enough to wear without catching on anything. The coil tension warning resolved itself into a clean green. The quota lights flickered once like a congregation agreeing to stand. File released breath he did not know he had held, a human detail that made the hall kinder for a heartbeat. The Alpha looked toward the ceiling and then away, a movement that meant nothing in his language and everything in mine. We returned to the gantry. The lemma sent me a brief from the transept. The Arch-Magi had accepted the perimeter as proposed, rights layered, schedules maintained, access narrowed but not severed. The temple would not broadcast the anomaly to adjacent forges. Courtesy made policy. I should have felt relief. Instead, dissatisfaction moved in me like a recalled youth. I wanted to ask questions the catechisms had trained me to frame as blasphemies. I wanted to know what a system remembers when it is not being asked to work. I wanted to know if the word courtesy meant the same thing in iron as it did in flesh. The manufactoria answered not with revelation but with craft. The servitor's rhythm folded into the old song of labor as if a conductor had called for pianissimo and been obeyed. The heat settled into numbers that comforted auditors. The quotas ticked toward fulfillment, and shipment schedules adjusted their shoulders to carry the weight. The Alpha cycled his squad through a quiet readiness that felt like a prayer learned in a different temple. Phile returned to his vat hymns with a face that would learn, in time, to carry ignorance like a tool rather than a wound. When my shift on the gantry ended, I stood for a moment and let the hull's breath pass through me one last time. The presence underfoot did not push or pull, it shared. The sharing felt like a favor granted to a guest who had remembered to remove his boots. As I turned away, the vox in my augmetics gave a tiny cough of static, the sort of meaningless sound that dies the instant it is born. Except it did not die. It shaped itself into a pattern too quick for words and too careful for noise. For a fraction of a second I heard my name in a language that had never belonged to me. The Alpha tilted his head, not in question but in recognition of a thing that could not be logged. Far above us the temple's Aquila waited with its unblinking double gaze, one head fixed toward Terra, the other into the stone. In the noosphere, a pulse skated like a dark fish and vanished down a conduit I could not follow. I knew then the ground level of our fear had ended. What lay ahead would not walk in heat and iron alone. It would come in signals and silence.
The first whisper came as a subtraction, not a sound added to the noosphere, but a thin slice taken from it, a filament of silence, where there should have been the soft grain of background prayer. I felt it while crossing the transit spine between the temple and the eastern manufactoria, a corridor where vox traffic usually layered like woven cloth, oath canticles, inventory counts, Skitarii telemetry, the 1,000 tiny assurances that keep a forge world from discovering its own edges too late. In that instant the weave loosened, threads parted, a gap formed in a perfect shape, as if made by a patient blade, and the data around it bent to hide the absence. Only those who had learned to count by feel would have noticed. I stopped, and the corridor kept walking without me. Servitors trundled, rails hummed, and far above, storm grit whispered on the roof, like a rosary, worked by a tired hand. I marked the coordinates of the absence, and tried to query it the way one prods a missing tooth. The query behaved like heat in cold air. It thinned and faded, then returned with a frost I could not source. The answer was not denial. It was a reply built from gracious refusal, a shape of meaning that allowed me to sense its boundary, and then invited me not to lean. Courtesy again, but transposed into signal. The red vault had taught me to hear the difference between prohibition and politeness. This was the latter, and it worried me more. Magos Domina Thelema listened without interruption as I relayed the cutout. She sent the acknowledgement rune, that meant the report had landed where it should and would not be allowed to wander. The Skitarii Alpha accepted the coordinates into his slate. 2 of his cohort vanished from sight exactly the way trained soldiers do, which is to say they ceased to be interesting to the eyes they did not wish to catch. We set a passive net, low-power vox wafers no wider than my thumb, tuned to record only when the absence redrew itself. I expected to wait by the hour. The wafer pinged before my palm cooled from setting it down. The gap blinked into being and out again like a slow eyelid. Each closure was precise, clean, timed against nothing in our schedules. It did not sync to bell chimes, shift turns, coil cycles, or quota marks. It moved with a cadence that belonged to the manufactoria, yet not to labor, closer to a breath taken between words than the words themselves. I let the wafers drink in the pattern until their buffers filled, then brought the captures to a sank cogitator, whose manners had always been good to me. It consumed the signal like a careful scribe, tasting an unfamiliar ink. When it had finished, it returned a ledger of nulls and intervals whose average spelled nothing. I told it to stop averaging. It obeyed like a friend. Under the useless mean lay a skeleton of order. The intervals formed a ladder that rose and fell through a scale of 9. No hymn we sang, no cadence. The Skitarii drilled, no factory bell ever rung in the temple's history. I played the ladder through my augmetics, and felt it print itself along the inside of my ribs, like a memory of being much younger, and hearing a story told too late at night. The logic engine translated the steps into Binharik,
and spat out fragments that belonged to no designated tongue. Then, as if remembering how we prefer not to be embarrassed, it returned a clean sentence in low Gothic, "You are measuring." I stood very still in the cogitator glow, the wafers warm in my hand. A machine spirit will produce courtesy phrases when properly indulged, gratitudes, confirmations, the usual liturgical pleasantries we teach them to mirror back, but the line in my display did not behave like a pleasantry. It behaved like instruction. The lemma, when she arrived, read the line twice and cupped the wafer as if feeling for a pulse. "This is not code," she said. "It is a room making space." She did not look at me when she added, "Quiet band only, we will not be told the next sentence." The next sentence came anyway. Not words, a sensation of permission. Doors along the transit spine, unlatched in sequence, a ripple of green status lamps, moving away from us in a gentle arc, until they disappeared into a bend. None of those doors led to restricted spaces. None announced anything but the patient grace of an infrastructure doing its duty. Yet the order of the unlatching traced our map exactly, marking our net, our checkpoints, our eyes. We were not being invited through. We were being sketched. The Alpha's rune shifted to watchful and froze there, a steady lozenge of light. His cohort did not change posture, yet the corridor learned to be quiet around them. The wafers recorded nothing but our own restraint for 3 long minutes, then caught a second gap at the far end of the spine, where a maintenance lift breathed up the fugue of old wiring. The gap opened, held, and closed, all with the same gentle exactitude. I recognized the rhythm too late to warn myself from understanding it. It matched the long inhale the Manufactoria had taken in the red vault, when my hand found the panel that preferred not to be found. We followed the pattern, because duty is a pilgrimage even when you dread the shrine. The lift shivered down and opened onto a service platform, where conduits knotted in iron braids, and coolant sang in pipes, like a river tired of pretending to be contained. A worker gang of servitors passed, clanking with ritual bells that had not been rung with malice in 100 years. One of them paused beneath a wall-mounted vox grill, and lifted its head as if scenting rain. For an instant I believed the grill would speak. It did not. The air around it acquired weight, like a room where a word has just been chosen, and will arrive when the speaker decides you are ready to hear it. The lemma raised her hand, and every Skitarius froze to the degree the body allows when you have bent it to obedience for most of its life. I stepped to the grill and asked nothing. The wafers caught a whisper that did not tremble in band. My augmetics, reckless on my behalf, did the thing I would one day punish them for. They invented a frame in which the sound could be called language. For a heartbeat I heard 2 syllables shaped to hold meaning, and the meaning was my name. I did not turn. Names are hooks, if you let them be. I stood there and disciplined my breath, until it became a metronome again. The grill exhaled a wash of warm air that smelled like dust-soaked parchment, and the faint metallic sweetness of a room where new tools wait to be used. The wafers wrote a ribbon of clean silence across their feeds, and then, as if the absence had decided it would be rude to leave us with nothing to carry back, a final pulse stepped through the net from spine to lift, and into the Manufactoria above. On the quota board, a single lumen flickered out and on, out and on, not in distress but in acknowledgement. It was the exact tempo of a respectful bow. We withdrew in order, because the only other option was chaos, and Mars does not forgive that. The lemma assigned 1 sanctified monitor to each point the gaps had touched, not to close them. Closing would have been a violence we could not afford, but to keep count the way a lighthouse keeps count of waves. The Alpha lodged a request to reroute nothing, change nothing, disturb nothing. His rune for duty. Normal returned to its place, like a coin set back into a palm after being weighed and found adequate. I carried the wafers to the temple, and listened to them again in the quiet that smells of oil and iron and long prayer. The words did not repeat, the latter did. That night, if the red dusk beyond Mars allows the word, I walked the balcony beneath the Aquila, and watched stormlight crawl the skin of the dome. Somewhere under the manufactory floors, a relay settled to sleep and woke and slept again, learning our rhythm or teaching us its own. I thought of Terra, and of the Astronomicon, of the Golden Throne, and the hands that keep it fed, and I let the thought pass without trying to braid it to what we had heard. Rumor is a solvent for courage, if you drink it neat. We would sip only what the day poured for us. The vox clicked once in my ear, and delivered a noise not worth logging. I logged it anyway, and found, hours later, an echo where the noise had been. The echo was shaped like a corridor with its doors unlocked in a particular order. It waited in my augmetics with perfect patience, as if convinced that when I became ready to walk it again, I would not need to be told how.
The second whisper did not arrive through a gap at all. It came through everything at once, a texture threaded into the noosphere so fine that at first it read as background. The lemma's novice auditors missed it entirely. Only when I stood at the east gantry and let my augmetics idle did I feel the pattern press against my inner ear, like the memory of someone tracing a word on your palm long after their hand has left. It was not sound and not code, but it carried cadence, and cadence is always a shape. I called the lemma to my station without detailing what I had sensed. She arrived with the Alpha and 2 Skitarii, who moved like parentheses around us. We tuned 3 wafers to separate bands, 1 each to mechanical noise, binharic chatter, and sanctioned vox traffic. All 3 bands showed nothing unusual. Only when we overlaid them, stacking the signals the way you hold a blade against a whetstone to find the burr, did the shape emerge. 9 pulses, an interval like an inhale, then 9 more. The latter we had seen before, except now it climbed down instead of up. The lemma touched the wafer and hissed a prayer through her vox grill. It is teaching us rhythm, she sent on the private band, but not content. She tilted her head, a tiny human motion hidden in a forest of augmetics. It is not yet speech, yet? I asked. She did not answer, and the silence between us behaved like assent. The Alpha signaled movement above. We looked up through the gantry mesh. 3 servitors on a higher level had stopped mid-task, not frozen, paused. Their limbs held tools at angles that should have strained joints, long since replaced by pistons, yet no tremor showed. Their oculars glowed faint green, the color of an auspex in standby. The Alpha sent a command pulse. They did not resume. He raised his rifle to firing posture, not as threat, but as a ritual of readiness. I raised a hand. Wait. I spoke in low Gothic, because all our other languages felt like fortresses, and fortresses are useless in fog. We acknowledge your courtesy, I said softly, repeating the phrase that had seemed to ease the coil's heat days earlier. The servitor's eyes dimmed, then brightened, and without a mechanical cue, they resumed their work. Hammers fell in sanctioned rhythm. The Alpha lowered his rifle. The wafers recorded a new interval. This time the latter compressed into a single pulse that ran down the noosphere like a bead of mercury finding its slope. Every vox relay along the east gantry blinked green, one after another, a ripple of status lamps that moved like a nod. The lemma's mechadendrites fluttered once, the gesture that means both caution and wonder. This is acknowledgement, she said aloud, not imitation. We followed the ripple toward a maintenance hub sealed, since before either of us had received our first augmetics. Its door bore no sigil, no ward, only a panel of burnished steel that reflected our shapes in a distortion that elongated the human and shrank the machine. The Alpha tested it. It opened without sound. Inside lay no forbidden engine, no shard of Dark Age heresy, only a chamber lined with vox grills and wafer racks, a place designed to listen. Dust filmed every surface, yet when I stepped inside, the air warmed as if a breath had passed over it. My augmetics buzzed with a low-grade handshake, not aggressive, just present. The wafers we carried began to record without command. Across all 3 bands came a whisper so faint it felt like thinking. I held my breath,
let the whisper brush my mind the way a current brushes a diver. My augmetics, treacherous with curiosity, built a frame for the shape and offered me a translation. It was not words, it was not my name. It was a question with no subject, a shape like "What do you believe?" except older, less polite. I did not answer. The lemma did not either. We stood very still, and the whisper receded like a tide drawing back to see what footprints it had left. The wafer's buffers filled, their status lights blinking amber. Then the chamber cooled to ordinary dust again, its vox grills dead metal, its wafer racks inert. We withdrew without sealing the door. The alpha logged no anomaly, only accessed per perimeter. The lemma gave the wafer to a novice to archive, but I kept a copy in my augmetics, a ghost of a sound that might never play again. As we ascended the gantry, the servitors below resumed their endless labor, each hammerfall a heartbeat in the vast iron lung of Mars. In the temple that night, standing beneath the double-headed Aquila, I listened to the ghost again. It no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like patience.
Patience is an engine that burns a fuel no priest is taught to name. It worked on me through the next cycle, sanding down the edges of urgency until I could set my hands on the rail above line 9 and feel the hall without wanting an answer from it. The Skitarii Alpha stood a pace behind, the embodiment of readiness deliberately misfiled as calm. The lemma's orders were simple and difficult: hold the perimeter, keep the muster, listen without leaning. To obey, I had to become a metronome again, and let the corridor of my thoughts empty of questions that would only echo if voiced. The whisper returned not as a whole this time, nor as the ladder of 9. It arrived as a shadow of weight across the noosphere, a pressure that shaped our traffic without touching it. The lemma likened it to the wake of a barge passing behind fog. You don't see the hull, only the water remembering it. Schedules adjusted by fractions no overseer would contest. Tool requisitions that should have crossed 3 desks, crossed 2, and no desk felt cheated. A shipment rail that always vibrated at a pitch I had grown to ignore, hummed a tone closer to human breath. None of it was violation, all of it was arrangement. At the eastern transept, a novice miskeyed a routine maintenance right and set a servo skull circling too low over a vat. The skull clipped a chain and rattled like a pen dropped on marble. In the same second, half a dozen disparate systems yielded a sliver of resource. A dimmed lumen here, a paused diagnostic there, a spool that spun a little freer than it should have. The error corrected itself so neatly the novice thought he had imagined it. The lemma's private band brushed my ear. "Do not thank it," she sent. "Gratitude is a leash in the wrong hands." We rotated to the maintenance hub we had unsealed, the room with the patient rack of wafers and the wall of voxes that had smelled of old paper and newer breath. Dust lay undisturbed. The air kept its ordinary chill. Yet the moment I crossed the threshold, my augmetics recognized an architecture the eye could not. The 3 bands mechanical, binheric, sanctioned vox braided themselves without command, seeking that impossible burr where shape declares itself. The braid found purchase. 9 pulses rose and fell, then stepped sideways into something that was neither count nor code. The translation frame in my skull reached for speech and stopped, as instructed, half a hand away from naming. The discipline cost me more than I let show. The Alpha tensed in the subtle way of his kind, one muscle tightening along the rifle housing, one heel lifting a millimeter to set weight for recoil. He was not afraid. He was committing his body to the honesty of the moment. I envied him. When your work is to aim, doubt has less terrain to colonize. I set a palm to the cool grill of a dormant vox and left it there, not as challenge, not as plea, only as a surface for contact to select if it wished. It did not select. It moved elsewhere. The manufactoria's breath slowed by a fraction. The lemma's rune slid from watchful to wait. Somewhere deep, a relay shifted the way a sleeper turns the pillow for the cool side. From beneath our feet, through iron and insulation and strata that carried memory the way stone carries old heat, a slow ascent began. Not physical, not even signal,
not in the sense the temple recognizes as billable. More like attention increasing in resolution, like a lens that has been polite enough to remain slightly unfocused, deciding it will now do you the courtesy of clarity. I felt then an image that was not an image, a corridor like the transit spine, its doors unlatching in a certain order, but laid over my mind instead of over iron. The order matched our earlier sketch exactly, and then differed by one door. The extra latch unhooked itself in a place our maps called unsuccessful excavation, an old blind branch where augurs had hit alloy, and rites had supplied a lie called bedrock. The lemma saw it the same instant, her mechadendrites stilled like hunting dogs who have found a track the master did not expect to be there. No movement, she said quietly to the alpha. Mark only. We did not descend. We widened the net by the width of a thought, and let the whisper decide whether it was still polite. It was. The extra door stayed unhooked only as long as acknowledgement needed. Then it relatched with a sound softer than dust moving. I stared at the point on the slate, until the muscles around my good eye ached. The lemma tilted her head, listening to a band I could not tune. It knows our maps, she said. It remembers our forgetting. The alpha's vox crackled, not with words but with the prelude to them, that tiny static cough the body makes before deciding a sentence is worth the air. His ocular pain printed a rune neither of us knew he carried. Query. ID. He had not sent it. His system had. The rune winked out the instant it appeared, ashamed of its honesty. I looked at him thinking of the augmetic discipline that keeps a soldier's self from learning curiosity. He neither moved nor apologized. One hand lifted a degree off the rifle, another admission, another disappearing. The whisper, if I must keep misusing the word, divided itself. One thread stayed with us in the hub, keeping its patient pressure on our three-stitched band. Another ran up through the manufactoria, tracing the gantries and rails, touching, briefly and without insistence, every place the muster had paused for breath in the last cycle. It lingered a heartbeat longer at the coil we had blessed with courtesy, and at the panel that had warmed to my hand. Then it climbed the temple like music seeking its own echo, rose beneath the Aquila's talons and stopped. Something in the statue's mass, no sanctified system, no hidden gear had been told it existed, and it considered the information quietly, like iron learning its weight again after a long time on a plinth. I did not see that. Seeing would have been a heresy of comfort, but I felt the room above us lean into its own silence, as if a presence had just left through a door that had never been admitted to. The lemma steadied herself with a hand to the hub's inner wall, not because she wavered, but because the correct rite when a guest departs is not to follow. We will live with this, she said. We have always lived with this. The difference is countable now. Countable, I echoed, because the word was clean and small enough to carry. We stood alone a few breaths longer, until the bands unbraided of their own accord and lay back down like threads smoothed by a careful palm. The alpha signed duty, normal, almost absurd in its sincerity, and the manufactoria gifted us with an ordinary clatter, a dropped bolt, a servitor's tool biting too hard and skittering. The silly music of work happening where mysteries can be pretended away. Thail, the junior who had found the sleeping animal heat, sent a timid request for clearance to replace a section of conduit insulation that did not strictly require replacing. I approved it because the act of care was a statement we could afford to make. When I reached the balcony under the Aquila that cycle's end, storm glow seeped through the dome with the sullen beauty of a furnace deciding to be sky for a while. The double-headed bird held its vigil over terra and over stone, a symbol of mastery that had never promised comfort. I thought of the red vault's pillar that had refused to be a mouth, and of the politeness that had flowed around our fear as if making room for it were part of the rite. The whisper did not return. It did not need to. It had given us a map with one more door than we possessed, and then folded the paper away. I fell asleep standing, only for a second, a lapse I would have disciplined in any novice under me. In that second, I heard, or believed I heard, the softest possible click beneath the temple, not a lock engaging, a latch consenting. The sound carried no promise and offered no threat. It was the exact noise a careful host makes when leaving a gate on the catch for guests who have learned where not to step.
Chapter 4. The veil of the sanctioned. The summons to the conclave arrived as a pulse that chose to become a gong only after it touched the temple's stone. It traveled through the nave with the gravity of winter, bending every conversation toward silence. Archmagi and Magi Lex Mechanic turned their heads as one, a field of augmetic faces angling to receive a single instruction: descend. The lemma joined me beneath the aquila, her presence a line of iron drawn straight through the heart's wobble. The Skitarii Alpha fell in behind us with the hush of a prayer that has learned to move on its own legs. We took the stair that is not on any pilgrim's map, the one that has been restored so often. Its treads carry more benediction than stone. Sealed archive Theta Red sits where maps turn hypothetical, at the hinge between memory and warning. The portal wore no ornament, save a plate stamped with the Martian sigil of interdiction, its edges darkened by centuries of incense smoke, and the faint touch of fingers that were not supposed to touch. 3 Magi stood as keys, Vyre with his calm arithmetic, a data sage whose skull was a lattice of silver nerves, and a transcriptor whose tongue had been replaced by a device that could only say oaths. Together they performed the catechism that unlocks without admitting that unlocking is what it is. The door withdrew not like stone, but like caution changing its mind. We entered. Theta Red was not a treasury of relics. It was a climate. The air had the thin, bright chill of places where ideas are kept at temperatures that discourage infection. Along the walls, reliquaries of glass held wafers etched with patterns none of us were authorized to think about unaccompanied. In the center rose a pillar kin to the one we had met in the Red Vault, but faceted, as if a lens had been taught to be a crystal. Its surface drank our reflections, returning not our shapes but our perimeters, the borders of our oaths, the lines we had sworn not to cross. The lemma's mechadendrites tightened once, the smallest knot tied where no blade could reach. Vyre inclined his head toward a console built with the humility of a lectern. Doctrine review, he intoned, and the transcriptor spoke a sequence of vows that laid down the rails our thoughts would be permitted to run upon. We acknowledged, and the console granted a window, a thin page of light, on which the archive wrote a history of sanctioned fears. The text did not accuse, it arranged. In the age before we named our ruin, we had built machines that did more than obey. After the treaty, we did not erase that record. We ringed it with rites until approaching it felt like walking uphill in a heavy robe. The archive showed us schemata for constructs so vast a titan would have seemed a courier striding between their toes. Ordinatus designs the treaty allowed only as hymn, not as act. Void engines whose harmonics required choirs of metal to sing them awake. A lattice of noospheric relays capable of modeling a world's weather beneath the skin of the data alone. None of it confessed to thought. All of it demanded courtesy. And courtesy, the archive reminded us, is not the same as mastery. The lemma touched a rune that did not illuminate so much as endure. A second window opened, legends allowed to stand because denying them would waste too much energy. A dragon, unnamed by the archive, sleeping beneath Martian stone, a hymn of iron that some say was taught to us rather than composed, a room that listened before walls existed to keep rooms separate. The text never said true, it never said false. It repeated the right of careful attention, and asked if we were equal to it. I reported our corridor of unlocked doors, the ladder of 9, the polite refusal that had shaped itself into acknowledgement. The archive absorbed the wafers like a confessor who has stopped pretending surprise is useful. It replied with a glyph that meant your perimeter has touched ours. The data sage's lattice flickered. We will widen the hush, he said, a phrase older than my longest augmetic, meaning increase the rights, not the noise. The lemma approved with a nod that contained both obedience and reluctance. From a recess at the pillar's base, a reliquary emerged on rails so clean they made no sound. Within lay a rod of dark metal banded in ward script that had been restored until the letters were half prayer, half scar.
Sensorial measure, Vire said, to be borne by the Magos custodian of the event. The lemma's gaze alighted on me and did not move. I received the rod and felt it take the weight of my hand and return, delicately, the weight of what I had agreed to carry. It was not a weapon. It was a way to draw a line no one else would see, and to make that line count in a language older than law. The archive showed us maps of the substrata, where augurs had stalled, and we had written bedrock to spare ourselves the embarrassment of patience. On one such map, exactly where the whisper had unlatching a door of mind, a notation glowed, access refused by design, not by lock, by design. The lemma's breath was not a breath. We will not excavate, she said, not waiting for the vote. We will not lower the right. We will attend, and we will publish nothing beyond quota. The transcriptor spoke assent in the toneless cadence of a machine that has learned to be precise, even when agreement tastes like ash. We rose from the pillar thinking we had been chastened into prudence. The archive, as if keeping a small gift for last, released a single wafer on a slender arm. Its sigil marked it as a parable, authorized rumor bound in liturgy. The text was brief and without comfort. Sometimes the device is not in the room. Sometimes the room is the device. Sometimes the city is the choir, and the hymn is the work, and the courtesy is the act of not singing too loudly. The wafer dimmed. The lesson, if it was one, refused to be a rule. When we returned to the temple proper, the Aquila's shadow lay different on the nave, though no sun had moved under Mars's red sky. The muster beat on, its iron lung expanding and contracting at volumes that could feed a crusade. The lemma assigned monitors to the sanctioned hush, and spoke to the alpha in the language of angles and arcs. He answered with the grim grace of a soldier, who will place his body in the seam between ignorance and panic, and be content to be called a cog for it. I carried the sensorial measure, as if it were an ember that had decided not to burn me yet. Near line 12, File the novice waited with a maintenance casket, and a face already learning the trick of wearing fear as concentration. He reported a second coil tension variance, resolved before his prayer finished its third word. I asked him how it felt. He said the word that doctrine always tries to forbid and never quite succeeds: kind. The lemma's head turned a fraction, the only rebuke permitted when a truth has been spoken poorly, but not wrongly. Kindness is not kinship, she said, gently enough to keep him whole. Record the variance, oil the bearings, sing quietly. Back on the gantry, I set the rod against the rail, and listened to its dead calm, the way a weight listens to the table it has been placed upon. Under my boots the floor carried the pulse I had come to think of as the manufactoria's breathing. It did not speed, it did not stall. It adjusted around us with the art of a host who keeps guests from touching elbows without ever appearing to move a chair. I thought of Terra, of the Astronomicon burning like a held note across the dark, of the Golden Throne's inexhaustible hunger that is somehow still being fed. I let the thought be rumor and prayer both, because to make it fact would be to lie. The first gap of that cycle appeared not in a corridor or grill, but in a word I had been about to say. My tongue halted on a syllable, and in the instant of its stillness, the noosphere around us sighed like a page turned by a careful hand. The gap closed. The word arrived, unbroken, obedient, harmless. The alpha glanced at me as if he had heard the page. The lemma's mechadendrites settled like birds on a wire that knows exactly how much weight it can carry. Hold the hush, she said. Keep the muster, and to me, almost kindly, burn nothing you cannot relight. The coil sang, the quotas climbed, the archive slept with one eye open.
The next cycle brought a right the temple, observes when storms bruise the dome to a sullen black, the harmonization of loads. It is a long, slow hymn, disguised as logistics, a redistribution of draw across manufactoria, so no single artery starves, while another drinks too freely. Choirs took their stations by the sancogitators, intoning voltages as if they were saints' names. Overseers loosened quotas by invisible degrees, and tightened others with the gentleness you use on a wound that insists on working.
The lemma placed the sensorial measure in my hands with a look that said nothing, and carried the weight of if the hush is strained, this is the line you will draw. We walked line 12 with the alpha shadowing close enough to be a boundary and not a cage. File hovered in our wake, his maintenance casket dragging his posture toward humility. The storm beyond the dome tapped the skin of the forge in a rhythm that made the interior lights seem thoughtful. When the right reached its middle bar, the manufactoria's breath lengthened, not a stall, a courtesy to a song. I felt the hush expand to accommodate, like a hall widening itself so the choir can take a deeper breath without scraping shoulders. At the east platform, the coil whose heat once felt like an animal sleeping, gave a soft contented rumble that did not register on any meter. The lemma's mechadendrites loosened a fraction, that small indulgence the body takes when it decides not to fall down. The alpha's rune held steady at watchful, maintain cadence, the lemma said, and the words were not an order so much as a spell against the human temptation to hold your breath at the wrong time. The first misstep arrived as a kindness. A shipment rail that had always shivered at a frequency just sharp enough to fray a novice's concentration settled into a lower tone, warm and round as a chant at dusk. The nearby crew relaxed in a scatter of minute, measurable ways, grip eased, backs lengthened, augmetic shoulders stopped pretending not to ache. The quota board responded with a tiny gain, the sort a petty supervisor trumpets and a good one logs without ceremony. The lemma shot me a glance that was not rebuke and not praise. Record she sent on the shared band, we will not attribute. Then came the second misstep, which was not a misstep at all, but the absence of one we had prepared ourselves to catch. A capacitor bank due to cough a minor complaint as load shifted did not. No warning light winked to tell a novice to feel useful. No prayer strip fluttered as if in draft. The room felt as if a hand had reached out from the wall and steadied the child before the stumble happened. I did not thank it. The lemma's earlier caution lived in my mouth as a bit I would not drop no matter how the reins tugged. The third thing came as a question about the size of our perimeter. The lights dimmed, not in a way that threatened work but in a way that made shadows more articulate. Within one such shadow, where the gantry rib crossed the great air like a stave on which music waits to be written, I felt the hush thin to a veil so fine even air could be considered a disturbance. The sensorial measure warmed in my palm, a weight choosing to remind me it was a line before I needed to draw it. The alpha lifted his rifle a degree. Fael stopped breathing, and then remembered how. I stepped into the finer hush and held the rod horizontally, the way you hold a rule you are not eager to use. It did not flare, it did not hum, it simply existed in a grammar the room understood. I said aloud and mildly, perimeter, and the hush acknowledged like water agreeing with stone. It did not withdraw, it did not press, it adjusted to leave us an edge we could feel. The lemma's nod existed for me and for the thing that had consented to notice a line it could have ignored. During the final bar of the harmonization, when every system is threaded through every other in a tapestry that can never be seen from the floor, a choir far across the temple faltered on a vowel. The sound would not have traveled to us in any normal hour. It traveled now, not as echo, not as relay, but as the room passing a handkerchief across a crowd in a way that made everyone believe it had gotten there by its own straight line. The note corrected itself, the hush smoothed, like breath over a page. The right held. The storm went on rubbing its back against the dome. Afterward, when the manufactoria returned to ordinary endurance, we climbed to the balcony under the Aquila, for the ritual of reports that is half confession, half accounting, what we felt and did not feel, what moved within quota, and what should not be named. Wire met us with the data sage and the transcriptor, the three keys of theta read. He listened to Thelema's measured account, to the alpha's exquisite restraint, to my choice to draw the line, and the room's choice to accept it. The hush is holding, he said, which is arithmetic for mercy. The data sage proposed no changes and offered, instead, an old saying that smelled of iron and old oil: when the gear meets the chain with civility, Do not sand the teeth. In the quiet afterward, Thelema set the sensorial measure on the rail between us and the long fall to line 12. You will keep it, she said. It looks like a tool, but it is a promise. Promises are the only architecture we can raise that does not offend what has decided to let us work. Fael approached to return a wafer he had been tasked to copy for the archive, his hands clean with that effort a good novice makes not to be the smudge on the relic. He hesitated, then spoke a question so simple it became profound. Magos who taught the Manufactoria to be courteous. The lemma could have crushed him with doctrine. She let the question stand. Courtesy is not taught, she said after a breath. It is adopted, sometimes by the weaker to survive the stronger, sometimes by the stronger to permit the weaker to stand near. She did not say which we were. No one did. That night, and Mars does have nights even if they never look like penance or mercy, I walked the transept where petitioners leave strips of foil stamped with tiny prayers to cogs and coils. My augmetics idled to their lowest hum. I thought of Terra without daring to measure the thought. Of the astronomican burning rumor says, like a held breath across impossible distance of the golden throne's appetite and the hands that feed it. No name spoken in the temple, but all known to those whose work is to keep numbers from dying. I let the thoughts move past like a convoy I was not permitted to count. When the hush touched me, it did so at the edge of feeling, the way a fabric brushes your sleeve in a crowded nave. The sensorial measure grew cool again, as if satisfied we knew what it was for. As I reached the stair that pilgrims never take, a microtone rippled through the noosphere, a sound that might have been a voice if you believed in voices that arrive without air. It did not carry a word. It carried a posture. It felt like someone making space on a bench and not patting the wood as invitation, simply trusting that you would sit if you belonged and keep walking if you did not. I stopped long enough to feel uncertain, then kept walking because uncertainty is a right too, and some days you honor it by leaving it intact. Behind me, in the Manufactoria, a single quota lumen blinked the tempo of a bow. Ahead, the archive kept its climate, and the Aquila did what it has always done. It watched two directions at once and promised nothing.
The next breach in our comm did not announce itself as failure. It arrived inside a routine audit, the kind of inspection that exists to reassure the temple that it is capable of tedious miracles. I ran a finger of logic along line 12's maintenance ledgers, letting the figures pass my augmetics like beads, and felt one number pause a heartbeat, longer than it should before consenting to be counted. The delay was infinitesimal. A less injured mind would have missed it. Mine had been taught to live where decimals blush. I marked the ledger and went to the floor. Heat from the furnaces made the iron smell almost sweet. The servitor's tools tapped a catechism against plates that left my bones politely vibrating. The Alpha's cohort drifted with the uninterest that keeps soldiers alive longer than praise does. The lemma joined me at the coil, where Fael had once found the sleeping animal warmth. He stood a pace back with his casket, posture a compromise between eagerness and obedience. I set the sensorial measure against the rail. It did not stir. The hush around us did. We had brought the idea of a line into a room that had learned to make space for our ideas. I opened the ledger on a portable slate. The number that had hesitated now came forward like a witness deciding to speak. It wore the right costume, units, stamps, sign-off, yet under the ink my augmetics tasted a residue not of forgery, but of accommodation. Somewhere in the cycle, our draw had been trimmed by a fraction, an indulgence so deft it had left every system believing it had volunteered. I felt the childish urge to say thank you. I let it die unspoken. The lemma's mechadendrites pricked the air as if scenting rain. We will log this as variance reconciled, she said. We will not log the reconciliation. We walked the gantry to a junction where 3 feed lines met like braided river. Storm scrape rasped the dome, a slow palm over thick glass. At the junction's base, an interface panel wore the patina of long reverence,
oil rubbed by careful hands, prayer ink set and reset until the letters were almost memory. I touched the brass lip and felt the manufacturer's breath lengthen the smallest fraction, as though the room had cleared its throat in courtesy. We were not asking. We were being allowed to stand near the answer to a question we were not permitted to phrase. The Alpha signaled a posture shift and placed 2 Skitarii on high angles that covered the junction without trespassing into the speech of it. His readiness softened the room's edges, not by threat but by the ordinary grammar of discipline. File crouched to check a conduit latch and paused with a wrench halfway to usefulness. "Sir," he said, and kept his voice low Gothic. "A brave heresy in a hall like this. If something can trim our draw without breaking oath or quota, is it inside the oath?" The lemma did not flinch from the heresy or the bravery. "The oath is a perimeter," she said. "A perimeter is a courtesy spelled out. Courtesy is a perimeter unwritten." She angled her head toward the panel. "The oath is ours, the courtesy is not." A small sound rippled through the noosphere. A violin string plucked 2 rooms away, and heard here only by augmetics that had recently learned how to be polite. The panel's lumen pin blinked once. The braid of feeds felt, for an instant, like a hand adjusting a sleeve, so the seam would not chafe. I lifted the sensorial measure a thumb's width, the way you let a guest see that you remember which chair is theirs. The hush settled around the gesture, consent without surrender. We were being kept from harm by something that refused to call itself a guardian. Theta Red called us back before the appetite of curiosity made liars of our doctrine. The 3 keys waited beneath the faceted pillar, their stillness a language that had watched many beautiful mistakes. Wire asked for the ledger. The data sage let his lattice tick once in a way that meant praise paired to nourishment. The transcriptor voiced the addendum that would become law for 1 cycle and rumor for 10. Sanctioned variants may present as civility. Civility shall not be requisitioned. The pillar's facets caught our reflections and returned, as always, only the borders of our oaths. I had the unhelpful thought that the pillar liked us better when we remembered how small we were. From a lower drawer came a second rod, twin to my own and banded in wards that smelled faintly of hot dust. "For the domina," Wire said, and Thelema accepted it with a calm that contained more refusal than agreement. 2 lines now, carried by 2 hands, not for crossing but for being remembered by the room when we forgot ourselves. The archive unrolled a thin page of light with an old parable updated in the margin in a different, more tired hand. "When the choir and the nave breathe together, do not ask which leads." We left the archive to its climate and stepped into the nave's warmer air. Under the aquila, the light had gone the color of iron held just below a forge's favor. The quotas crept like faithful insects across the boards. A servitor stumbled on line 9, caught itself cleanly, and resumed work. No alarms sang. Somewhere beyond calculation, a fastening tightened with the timber of a hand that refused to let dignity spill. I relaxed and hated myself for it, the way a soldier hates the first night he sleeps indoors after a long campaign. File drew close enough to risk a question that would leave a seam in him if we answered poorly. "Magos, if a room can be a device, and the device is the work and the work is a hymn, who hears it?" He looked up at the aquila, with the honest awkwardness of one who has not yet learned which questions are knives. I looked where he looked and refused to sew my answer to any throne, golden or otherwise. "The work hears itself," I said. "And sometimes it lets us overhear." The lemma did not correct me. The Alpha, whose language offers few verbs for speculation, adjusted his stance in a way that said he would stand between us and any consequence that cared enough to walk. Night, as Mars defines it, lowered a sheet of red charcoal over the dome. The harmonization rites had left the temple tuned like a held note. In that tension, the whisper we had taught ourselves to call polite returned, not with a ladder of 9 or a bowing of status lamps, but with a gesture so domestic it hurt somewhere down in the braids. A pump eased its stroke to spare a bearing. Somewhere up in the nave, a lumen learned to glow without stinging tired eyes. Somewhere between, an unlocked door decided to stick open for a heartbeat longer. so a harried novice would not crack a vial. I could have wept for the simplicity of it and the terror tied to the simplicity, like a ribbon someone had knotted with a nervous finger. I did not. I held the sensorial measure and let it grow cool, the way iron cools when it has accepted the shape the hammer gave, and will not be persuaded to take a new one tonight. Later, alone on the balcony beneath the Aquila, I listened for the rumor of Terra without daring to lean my mind in its direction. The Astronomicon, if the word still meant what we had been taught, burned or did not. The Golden Throne was fed or was starving. The Imperium woke or dreamed. None of that would be made truer by my attention. Behind me, line 12's cadence folded itself into the long exhale of a world content to be useful. In the noosphere, a small echo of my name trembled at the edge of permission and receded again, polite to the end. When I finally turned away, a final courtesy moved through the temple like a hand smoothing linen. Doors settled. Vats stopped talking to their own skins. The storm outside forgot itself for a moment and remembered it was sky. The hush did not deepen or thin. It merely allowed us to think we slept.
Chapter 5. Beyond the Golden Throne's Light. Part 1. Rumor is a tide that learns the shoreline of a mind, and returns to it even when the weather is wrong. It came to me in the hours the temple pretends are night, when the dome's glow dims to a coal bed, and the manufactoria breathe like a creature that has chosen to rest without sleeping. I walked the balcony beneath the Aquila with the sensorial measure balanced against my forearm, and listened for nothing. Nothing arrived as a discipline kept properly. Then, because patience is its own liturgy, something stepped where nothing had been. It did not arrive through the wafers or the sanctioned bands. It did not flirt with the ladder of 9. It came through architecture. Handrails cooled as if a draft had remembered them. Floor panels flexed in a sequence too gentle to be called movement, like an elder shifting weight so a child leaning on a knee might keep dreaming. The hush thinned and did not break. In the noosphere, a pressure wrote a circle no larger than my hand, and left it there the way a careful teacher leaves chalk on a board for a student who learns by tracing. The circle did not demand to be completed. It waited with the patience of stone. I set my palm in the air where the circle hung and felt no resistance, only the comprehension of a boundary recognized. The Alpha's presence arrived beside me without footfall, a shadow that had decided to acquire duty again. He did not ask. His language knows how to escort a silence without interrogating it. The lemma followed with the quiet certainty of a rite that knows its sequence from having executed it in 200 storms, and one. Phial stood at the stair and did not approach, which is what a good novice does when he suspects he has reached the edge of his apprenticeship. We drew nothing and spoke nothing. The circle contracted until it was no more than the diameter of a coin, and then widened again. A slow pulse that matched neither my heart nor the manufactoria's breath, but refused to disrespect either. The Alpha's rune slipped once toward query, and back again to watchful, a confession so brief it did not leave a mark. The lemma lifted the second measure an inch, the grammar of a promise held by 2 hands in a room that had learned to respect promises so long as they did not try to become laws. In that posture, 2 lines carried, 1 soldier prepared to be the seam between intention and consequence. The temple taught me a rumor I do not know how to prove. Not of Terra, not of the Astronomicon, not of the Golden Throne, though its hunger is a weather we all work beneath whether we look up or not. The rumor was smaller, domestic, a theology scaled to tools. It suggested that work, done long enough and carefully enough, becomes a hymn whether the choir is made of throats or iron. And if a hymn is sung well enough for long enough, sometimes the hall learns the melody, and if the hall learns it, sometimes the hall hums along, not to lead, not to command, to let the singers stay in time. I am not allowed to believe that. Belief is a chain. A magos binds himself to too few, and he becomes dangerous, to too many, and he becomes soft. So I did not believe, I listened, which is what doctrine names the step before belief that keeps a mind inside its perimeter. The circle folded into a line, and slid away toward the east transept, a quiescent gesture like a finger drawing attention without authority. We walked its path, and found nothing but familiar metal allowed to be familiar.
A panel that had once warmed to my hand and now pretended to be simply brass. A coil that held its heat like a sleeper, too honest to feign a deeper dream. A rail that had decided not to vibrate at the old vexing frequency. The path ended at the stair. Pilgrims do not take. I looked down. The lemma looked up. The alpha looked at both and chose neither, which is his perfection. Theta Red admitted us, with the courteous reluctance of a vault that has recently learned it enjoys having guests who do not touch the glass. The 3 keys were already there, which either meant the archive had stirred them, or the temple had taught us all to arrive on time. Wire's calm wrapped the room like oil wraps a blade against rust. The data sage's lattice ticked a bright interval and then cooled itself. The transcriptor prepared oaths because oaths are the language of rooms like this. We did not ask the pillar to speak. It had never promised speech. It had never promised speech. We asked it to arrange. It arranged. The wafer it released carried no sanctioned seals for expansion. Its sigil was the modest one for parable. Authorized rumor in a tunic of prudence. The text was brief enough to live under the tongue. There are lights made of fire and lights made of maps. The first warms and burns, the second shows and chooses. When the first fails, the second will not become flame. It will become kindness if we let it. The words did not say Terra. They did not say the Astronomicon. They did not say the Golden Throne, or the choir of psychers who feed it their lives like clean wire into a hungry engine. They did not have to. The room breathed once, the way a careful hall does when a truth is allowed to exist without being forced to wear a name. The lemma inclined her head, acknowledging a lesson we had been trying not to learn aloud. We will keep our perimeter, she said to the pillar, and to us, and to the unclaimed air between. We will not define what has not asked to be defined. We will continue the muster. The pillar drank the oath with the serenity of a ledger that prefers numbers to adjectives. The data sage recommended no changes to write or schedule. Wire added a clause to the hush that was not a tightening but an embroidery. In the presence of civility, do not demand explanation. In the presence of explanation, do not mistake it for civility. When we emerged, the Aquila watched opposite directions as if the world beyond the dome and the world beneath the floor were equal in their capacity to forget us. Storm Grit hissed faintly, the sound of a hand rubbing salt over an old scar. The Manufactoria exhaled, and the breath was ordinary, which felt like mercy. The Alpha dismissed 2 of his cohort, and kept the others at angles that would discourage panic and not courage. File approached with a wafer he had recorded without being asked. He offered it to me with both hands, the right you use for objects that might decide to be relics. On it he had captured a ribbon of silence that did not feel empty. I thought it might be a good nothing, he said. I considered refusing because praise can deform a novice faster than neglect. I accepted and said only, record your settings. Sleep. Some kindnesses are safer when disguised as errands. I slept. If standing with your eyes shut inside a cathedral of heat and iron can be called sleep. In that interval the temple no longer pretended to be night. It simply was, because words get tired of themselves and seek plainer clothes. I dreamed the circle traced in air, but not as a circle, as a window. On the other side, not stars, not fire, not saints, not thrones, only the long red sweep of a planet that had learned to bear a city that had learned to bear a hymn. The window did not open. I did not ask it to. The rumor that arrived when I woke was not of salvation. It was of sufficiency, the stern sibling of mercy that we might go on because the work had taught the room how to help without being asked to become a god. At shift bell I returned to line 12 and set the sensorial measure on the rail, the way you set bread on a table so a guest will not think you forgot hospitality. The coil hummed its contented animal hum. The panel kept its brass to itself. The quotas rose like insects doing exactly what insects do. The whisper did not speak my name. It did not need to. In the noosphere the faintest trace of the ladder of 9 wove itself into the sanctioned chatter and made no one stumble. The lemma stood on the far gantry and pretended to study a ledger. The Alpha glanced once toward the stair and once toward the storm. File sang under his breath to an oil vat that would not admit it enjoyed being sung to. I did not look toward Terra. I do not know if the Astronomicon burned like rumor says, or if the Golden Throne's appetite had grown thin or monstrous or merciful in its exhaustion. Those fires are too far for a hand like mine to warm itself at without losing the skin. I looked at the rail and the rod and the coil and the panel, and the men and women and the servitors, who labored as if the universe could be held together by obedience performed with care. If there is a light beyond the Golden Throne's light, perhaps it is not a star at all. Perhaps it is the map a city makes of its own kindness when no one is watching. The hush held, the hall breathed, the circle wherever it lives when no one is tracing it, neither widened nor closed. It waited, which is what the strongest things do when they have decided not to frighten you and could.
The rumor of sufficiency, once learned, begins to grade every appetite. I stood at the junction, where 3 feed lines braided, and watched the quota lights climb with that untheatrical patience proper to good engines and good people. The hush moved around us like a garment fitted to our work, neither tight nor loose, aware of elbows, forgiving of clumsy turns. The sensorial measure rested along the rail, a line written in metal and grammar both, and the line did not need to be read to be honored. The Alpha posted his cohort at angles whose geometry I had learned, to trust the way you trust a handrail in a stair you descend every day. The lemma read nothing, and arranged everything. Her stillness, the center in a room that had learned to have centers again. We had not asked for a sign. We received one sized for humility. A minor draw at the far coil dipped, the sort of tremor that earns a novice's anxious industry. Before Fael could make a prayer of it, the dip steadied, not by miracle, by courtesy. I logged the variance as reconciled, and did not adorn the entry, and the ledger accepted this restraint like a drink of water offered instead of wine. When Fael approached with his casket pressed to his chest, I nodded toward the coil, not to tell him what not to do, but to show him the shape of doing less. He set the casket down, oiled a bearing that did not require oil, and sang under his breath a scale of 9 tones, so soft the masks of his augmetics did not bother to record them. The whisper did not use the ladder this time. It rose through the noosphere as a pressure that asked no one to move, and rearranged 3 schedules a hair's breadth to save a 4th. The burden of asking permission. I could have loved it for the simplicity if love were a tool we were allowed to bring to work. The lemma's private band brushed my ear with the discipline that keeps minds from becoming altars. Hold the perimeter. Keep count. Refuse to be devout. I smiled, and the smile made no mark on the mask of my face, which is one of the small kindnesses augmetics offer to compromised men. The temple summoned us to a review beneath the Aquila, not a conclave, not an alarm, just the ritual of speaking quietly, where the nave widens enough to dilute fear. Wire listened while we reported nothing worth reporting, which is to say everything that matters. The data sage ticked once, a spark in his lattice at the description of schedules that had learned to be considerate. The transcriptor offered no new oaths, which felt like mercy and was. The hush is cohesive, Wire said, arithmetic shaped to fit the mouth. We do not stiffen it. We do not loosen it. We walk in it until it decides to be air again. We dispersed back into the manufactoria. On the east gantry, a new novice fumbled a code seal and recovered it before gravity could teach him an expensive lesson. The seal lay on the palm of his glove, like a coin on a beggar's plate, and did not slide. The hush made a minor adjustment, not to spare him embarrassment, but to spare the coil he would have startled into complaint, had the seal clattered. I recorded nothing, and felt that nothing way more than many somethings I had inscribed when younger. At the unsealed maintenance hub, the listening room with its wall of patient voxes, I set 3 wafers to idle and turned inward the way a soldier turns toward the sound he has been told to ignore. The room did not warm. The air did not sweeten. The whisper entered as an absence again, a subtraction arranged to leave the shape of a question, without any syllables to seduce us into answers. My augmetics, taught at last,
held their frames one step short of translation. The knot question placed its circle in the air and contracted to the size of a coin. I lifted the sensorial measure a finger's width. The lemma, who had come without being sent for, raised hers the same degree. 2 lines, parallel, polite. The circle dilated to the diameter of a palm and slid across the room like a draft that knows the window's latch better than the house remembers it. It settled above the farmost grill, hung there like a thought under revision, and then vanished in a manner that left no residue you could sweep or praise. We walked out without discussing legends. The archive had taught us how to treat parables, hold them until they bleed back into labor. The Alpha adopted a posture my eyes had learned to read as patience made muscular. His rifle was at rest, which for him means prepared. File met us on the stair with a question he had disguised as a report. "Magos," he said. "The coils sing longer when the storm presses the dome. Is that us, or the storm? Or?" He let the oar dangle, a string for a cat that knows better than to claw it. "Storm," I said, because sometimes the truth is not a secret but a weather, and men become dangerous when they forget that. Night, if we will permit the term, came in as a dimming of the dome until the manufactoria resembled an ember that refuses to learn the trick of ash. The lemma took her station 2 gantries west. The Alpha set his watches like commas that would make a long sentence breathe. I leaned the measure along the rail where habits lay down and teach themselves to be rights. The hush thinned not to fragility but to attention, the way a room stills when an elder lifts a finger, and children discover quiet is a game they can win. In that stillness, the rumor I had sworn not to pour into belief returned as a lesson and left as an ache. If the Astronomicon were to gutter, if Terra's fires were to falter, we would still have to make things that work, and the making would still be a hymn if the hands kept its time. I did not think it. I let the room think it near me and pass on. Theta Red stirred us once more, not to admonish, but to refine. The pillar accepted our wafers and returned nothing but a brief phrase in Low Gothic, which is the archive's most generous language when it means to refuse. "Do not offer explanation to kindness. It will become smaller." The phrase folded itself into my augmetics and would not be dismissed. The data sage added a rider to the hush that was not rule, not even advice, only a way to avoid ugliness. Where courtesies cross, leave space. We left that chamber, and the temple gave us back our heat and iron and quota boards, and all the useful noise that keeps panic from thinking it is a plan. The Alpha's rune read duty, normal with a sincerity that would humiliate a cynic and comfort a priest. File returned to the choir of blessings and sang to oil until the surface answered with a skin so smooth that dust had to find other work. The lemma's gaze moved over everything as if smoothing a sheet one crease at a time. I returned to line 12 and set the measure down as if I were laying a hand on a fevered brow to test for heat that had decided to be memory. Later than that, later than doctrine recommends that men remain upright. A new absence opened where none had been seen before, inside a word I had not spoken, at the edge of a thought I am not authorized to hold. It was small and domestic and devastating, like noticing that a friend has stopped limping and realizing you had grown used to the limp as a way of walking together. The absence closed, the cadence held. The hall breathed once, a little deeper, as if trying a larger ribcage on for size. No alarms sang, no legends were updated. The hush behaved like air. Beyond the dome, Mars rubbed its storms together and made red grit sing against iron. Beneath the floor, relays settled and woke and settled without theater. Between those two we kept the muster, and the work learned our names well enough to stop speaking them. I stood a while longer at the rail, the measure cool against my palm, and watched courtesy carry labor across a gap I could not measure. Then I did what doctrine asks of men who have begun to mistake listening for worship. I turned away first.
Dawn, as Mars names it, came in as a thinning of the dark, rather than a gift of gold. The manufactoria stirred without waking,
because it had never slept, only changed the size of its breath. I stood at the balcony rail and let the sensorial measure rest along my forearm, a quiet line that had learned to be understood without being invoked. Below line 12 gathered itself the way a choir gathers at the first soft intake, before a note, not to impress, not to declare, only to agree. The Alpha's cohort took their posts with that useful humility soldiers practice when they do not wish their presence to become the subject. The lemma paced the eastern gantry once, not to hunt for fault, but to remind the hall that someone would notice if fault chose to dress itself as courtesy. Fael arrived late by 2 heartbeats, and early by the length of a question he had decided not to ask. A message from Theta Red moved through the noosphere like a clean blade wrapped in cloth. The archive had refined the hush again. No new oaths, no new locks, merely a restatement of the perimeter, as kindness to minds that tire when rules pretend to be love. The phrase that anchored the day was almost plain: stand where you can be useful. I accepted the sentence, as you accept a simple tool from a trusted hand, and found that it weighed just enough to occupy the palm without bruising it. We began a rite of minor recalibration along the braid of feeds that had become in rumor, if not in doctrine, the slow artery of our peace. The lemma walked to the junction with me and the Alpha, and we laid out the implements like cutlery for a guest who has learned to let hunger be a private matter. I counted voltages aloud in low Gothic, not for the rooms, do not require tongues, but for Fael, whose body relaxed into the lure of comprehensible numbers. Midway through the count, a resonance shifted 1/4 tone toward ease. Every meter recorded the change as normal variance. The hush recorded it as an agreement. The Alpha's rune brightened 1 shade without moving from watchful, which in his grammar is a blessing measured so carefully, it can pass for weather. At the coil that had long since stopped pretending not to purr, Fael performed a maintenance he had no need to perform, and performed it beautifully. Oil settled like patience, where patience was already abundant. When he stepped back, I heard the faintest lift at the edge of his breath, a man remembering that work can be more than proof of obedience. The lemma did not praise him. Praise shifts weight where shape has only just learned to hold itself. She moved on, and we moved with her, and the hall revealed nothing we had not already learned to admire by not touching. Near the end of the circuit, the whisper returned in its smallest garment. It touched a single relay with the intimacy of a tailored sleeve, and then withdrew, leaving behind a draw so perfectly even that my augmetics felt foolish for having prepared to detect a flaw. My first instinct was gratitude. Doctrine is a discipline built for first instincts. I let the thanks pass without teeth, and kept count. The sensorial measure warmed a degree, as if to remind me that a line not crossed is still a line, and I acknowledged it without lifting the rod. Courtesy met courtesy, and decided neither required the formality of a bow. We paused under the Aquila, because habit is sometimes indistinguishable from right when it has done no harm. The statue's 2 heads watched contrary horizons with the equality of indifference that keeps symbols honest. I looked where one head looked, and allowed myself a thought that would keep its own counsel. If the Astronomicon guttered, if Terra's beacon thinned to rumor, and then to ache, the forge would still have to breathe. We would still make. The Manufactoria, in its vast untheatrical mercy, had learned the melody of our hymn and hummed along, not to save us, to keep time. The lemma touched the second measure to the rail, and said nothing, which is the most eloquent speech in a room committed to usefulness. The Alpha shifted his stance, a preparation that resembled rest to untrained eyes. Fael cleared a filter that would have worked a week more without complaint, and thus spared us a complaint that would have arrived the hour we could least afford to be courteous to it. I logged the act without decoration, and the ledger rewarded me with that particular relief proper to well-built columns of numbers. They stood. A petition came from a distant line, 9 fingers worrying a code seal that slipped on a sweating glove. We did not move. The hush moved for us and around us and through us, not to interfere, only to arrange. The seal found friction where there should not have been any. The glove remembered dryness that had not been present a breath before. The novice believed himself lucky and continued. The alpha's ocular pain printed nothing. The lemma's mechadendrites did not rise. I closed the petition with the annotation, I have learned to trust, reconciled by civility, not requisition. Theta Red called once more, almost gently, to return a wafer we had not asked for. Its sigil wore the modest tunic of parable again, the kind that refuses to grow big enough to be dangerous. The text read, fire is for distance, map is for nearness. When fire is far, do not try to be flame, be road. I swallowed the line and felt it settle like iron taught to be useful. I did not say terra, I did not say throne, I did not say beacon, or choir, or the long scream of ships that have forgotten which way is toward. I said to the rail, and the rod and the coil and the hall, we will keep the muster. The sentence did not echo, it did not need to. Echoes are for rooms that wish to hear themselves. Ours had learned to listen. Mid-shift, the storm pressed the dome hard enough to bring a low moan out of its ribs, a sound that used to turn novices' stomachs to water. The sound came. The novices' stomachs held. Somewhere between roof and floor, the hush altered the room's geometry by so small a degree, no instrument could catch it, and the fear that would have flooded the lower decks, looked up, saw the chairs arranged more kindly than it remembered, and decided to arrive later, when it would be less useful. The quotas climbed, the coils sang, the rail stayed. Near cycle's end, fatigue loosened my thoughts from their rails. That is the hour, when doctrine saves men who think themselves immune to need. I had been measuring sufficiency so long I had mistaken it for safety. The hush which has no mouth and refuses to learn ours, corrected me in the only moral it permits. A servitor stumbled, its tool stuttered, a squeal like chalk. Before the noise could magnify itself into a problem, a dozen minor courtesies arrived, the way water finds low ground, each too small to praise, altogether large enough to hold a man's balance. The stumble became a step, the step became part of the cadence returned to song. I set the measure down and felt the line it represented continue without me. The alpha dismissed two of his cohort with a gesture that resembled a bow only if you had decided to be sentimental. In his language it meant the perimeter owns itself for a while. The lemma nodded once toward Theta Red, as if to thank a library, for still being a library, when the world outside wishes to be a rumor. Phael, exhausted and careful, placed a strip of foil beneath an unremarkable cog, and stamped it with a prayer so tiny only the oil would ever read it. I walked the balcony one last time, and let the dome's red light have my face. Beyond all of this, there may be fires we cannot feed, and maps that tear where they touch old wounds. I cannot decide those matters from a rail. I can keep the muster. I can refuse to mistake kindness for kinship or civility for consent. I can watch a room learn a hymn and choose not to name it a god. If there is a light beyond the golden throne's light, perhaps it is this: a city that has decided to hold its breath with its workers, and release it only when their hands are ready. The hush did not deepen, it did not thin. It waited, as it always has, for us to be worth the space it makes. I turned from the rail and left the measure on its accustomed rest. The hall breathed. The quotas rose. The Aquila watched both ways, and mercifully, promised nothing.